The crowd stood still. John stood surrounded by security guards as the officer, staring coldly at him, said, "You have no idea what you just did." He thought it was just a joke, but it turned into a nightmare. But let's start from the very beginning. John was on vacation in London, and every day he felt like he was in the center of world history. It was his first trip to Europe, and his curiosity knew no bounds. He had already visited the Tower of London, taken a ride on the London Eye, but Buckingham Palace felt different, like the final piece of the puzzle in his journey. As he approached the palace, John immediately noticed them, the guards, towering figures in red uniforms, black helmets, and stern faces. An aura of almost sacred silence surrounded them. They stood motionless, like statues, creating a strange, almost magical atmosphere. But John, like many tourists, thought it was nothing more than a theatrical show. He wasn't content with just watching and admiring. Back home, his friends had joked that he should try to get a reaction from the guards, and John decided he would do more than just observe. A plan was already taking shape in his mind. He started moving closer to one of the guards, carefully choosing his moment. He knew these soldiers never moved, their faces never changed, and their actions were so precise they seemed almost mechanical. But John didn't fully believe that. He was convinced he could break the stillness of this lifeless guard, like in some old movie. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. This was the perfect moment to prove himself. He stepped boldly toward the guard, glanced around to make sure no one would interfere, and then lifted his foot. With lightning speed, he tried to kick the guard's side. But at the last moment, something went wrong. As if sensing the danger, the guard shifted just a fraction of an inch. The second John threw his leg forward, it missed the target entirely. His balance was off. He felt his body tip forward, and despite his desperate efforts to steady himself, he crashed onto the pavement with a loud thud, drawing the attention of dozens of onlookers. As John lay on the ground, feeling the ache in his leg and the embarrassment burning through him, the guard remained completely still, as if nothing had happened. He didn't even glance at the fallen tourist. His eyes showed no emotion, only emptiness. John scrambled to his feet, glancing around to make sure no one had caught his fall on camera. The dust on his clothes served as a reminder of his failed attempt. But in that moment, he realized he hadn't just fallen. He had made a mistake that would soon bring him consequences, far more serious than he could have ever imagined, after John nearly hit the guard and ended up on the ground. Instead, his laughter quickly turned to shock. He felt his body unexpectedly lift off the pavement, and in the next moment, he landed hard on his back with a loud thud. The sounds of his friend's laughter, loud and contagious, just moments ago, faded into a cold silence. John's face flushed with embarrassment. As he quickly got up, brushing the dust off his jeans, trying to maintain his dignity. But the incident was far from over. Despite his attempts to laugh it off or play it cool, the attention was no longer on just his fall. It was on the fact that he had broken the rules. The guard, without moving a muscle, continued to stand firm, showing neither surprise nor annoyance. His expression remained as stone-cold as before. But John felt the weight of his gaze. It was the look of a true sentinel, a man who had seen 1,000 fools before and knew exactly how to deal with them. And that look, despite its calmness, sent a shiver down John's spine. He tried to lighten the mood, striking a victory pose. But then, the guard stepped toward him. His voice was cold, strict, leaving no room for argument. "Do not approach me. Control yourself." In that moment, John felt everything shift. Other guards stood nearby, and while they hadn't intervened yet, he was beginning to realize that the situation was escalating beyond his control. His friends, who had been watching from a short distance, had initially kept laughing, but as they noticed the change in the atmosphere, their chuckles faded. They exchanged uncertain glances, some looking nervous. The guard took another step forward. His movements were so precise and controlled that John understood. He was no longer just a foolish tourist in the eyes of his friends, but the center of attention for the other guards, who were slowly closing in around him. His heart began to race. What had seemed like a harmless joke a minute ago now felt like a dangerous miscalculation. The situation was shifting in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Nothing extreme had happened yet, but John could feel the tension in the air. The guards were closing in, and this was no longer just a funny incident. It was starting to feel like a potential conflict. John tried to keep his cool, but deep down he knew there was no easy way out of this. And then it hit him. He had made a mistake. A big one. And it was already too late. "I didn't mean to. I was just joking, you know?" John tried to explain, his voice coming out louder than he intended. The words echoed in the sudden silence that had taken over the space around him. He looked back at his friends, expecting to see a few smiles, the same encouraging grins that had kept the mood light until now. But they just stood there, watching him, their faces tense. They weren't laughing anymore. Their eyes held a certain confusion, as if they too didn't fully understand what had just happened, but they knew something was off. John nervously rubbed his hands against his jeans, searching for the right words to reset the situation. But no matter how hard he tried, things weren't getting better. It felt like something heavy had settled over him, hanging in the cold gray sky above. His words didn't seem to carry any weight anymore. They just vanished into the air. He couldn't quite pinpoint what had caused this sudden chill in his friends' eyes, in their silent stares. But then, when his gaze met the guard's once again, he felt it. He was losing control. The guard, emotionless as ever, took a small step forward. He didn't say a word, just lifted his chin slightly, as if assessing John from the height of his post. At that moment, John felt his chest tighten with uncertainty. What happens now? He tried to explain himself again, but this time, the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't look away from the guard. But the guard didn't care about his words. Instead, he turned and spoke to the other security personnel. John felt a hollow pit form in his chest. The words meant nothing to him, but the tone was clear. The guard's speech was sharp, rhythmic, and military-like, filling the air with an unmistakable sense of authority. John had no idea what was being said, but he knew it wasn't good. His desperate attempts to explain himself faded into the background of those cold, precise commands. He swallowed hard, his knees suddenly feeling a little weaker. He looked at his friends again. They now stood with their hands in their pockets, silent. None of them made a move to step in or say anything. Even those who were always ready to back him up seemed unsure of how to react. And in that moment, he understood. His words, his laughter, none of it mattered anymore. The guard, after a brief glance around, seemed to assess that no one else had crossed the line. Without acknowledging John further, he turned back to his colleagues, continuing his discussion. John's breathing grew heavy. His eyes locked onto another guard standing nearby. That guard looked at him with a certain expression, not just annoyance, but something deeper, something more serious. The silence stretched on, just a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity, and John knew everything now depended on how the guards chose to respond to his reckless act. When one of the security officers standing nearby took a step forward, John hoped this would all be over soon. He was ready to admit his mistake, apologize, and get back to having fun, though with a slight sense of embarrassment. The officer didn't look particularly aggressive. In fact, his expression was calm, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in John's eyes. "Come with me," the officer said, gesturing toward a door leading to one of the palace's restricted areas. "We need to figure out what happened." His tone was even, without any direct threats, but something about the way he said it made John feel uneasy. At first, John thought the officer was just going to have a brief chat with him. Nothing more. Maybe he'd even crack a joke about it and let him off with a light warning. After all, it was just a prank, right? A silly joke that should have been forgotten by now. He even fought the urge to smile, wondering if his friends were still laughing and feeling sorry for him at the same time. Yeah, of course. Just a talk," John murmured, trying to mask his nervousness, not very successfully. He followed the officer, expecting this minor trouble to end as quickly as it had begun. But the further they walked, the stranger it felt. The officer didn't say a word along the way, and John started to feel the tension growing. He glanced around. The palace corridors looked exactly as he had imagined, but now they seemed much more intimidating. When they reached a door, the guard gestured for John to step inside. The room was small but well furnished, with a few chairs and a table. The officer didn't offer him a seat, and instead stood by the door. At that moment, a deep sense of anxiety settled inside John. "We just need to clarify a few things. Everything will be fine," the guard said. But something in his voice made John freeze. It wasn't reassuring, it was firm and detached. John stood there, watching, as the officer checked his phone a few times, made a couple of calls, and then looked back at him with that same blank expression. The waiting was suffocating, especially when John heard someone else walking past the door, a man in a sharp suit, moving with authority. Clearly, this situation was becoming more serious. Before John could fully process what was happening, the door swung open, and 2 more men walked in. They weren't wearing red uniforms. Their attire was different. One of them was older, with a lined face and an ironclad stare. The other was younger but just as composed and serious. They started speaking, but John could barely understand a word. It was a language he didn't know, and his chest tightened with fear. "What do you want?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was a tremble in it. He tried to explain that it was just a harmless joke, nothing more. But when he met the older officer's eyes, he got no response. Instead, the officer simply gave a brief nod to his younger colleague, who immediately turned and left the room without saying a word. John felt his anxiety spike. He stood there trying to keep his emotions in check. But the longer he remained in this room, the more he realized that his harmless prank had led to something far more serious. This was escalating beyond anything he had expected. The guards were known for their discipline, their strict adherence to protocol. Their duty was to maintain order, and even the smallest violation of the rules could lead to significant consequences. There was no room for jokes in their world. John was finally beginning to understand that he was no longer in control of the situation. Time passed, and he still had no clue what was going to happen next. He tried to defend himself, to explain his actions, but his words seemed to carry no weight. Once, so sure that his prank was harmless, he now stood before a serious reality, one that left him with only 2 choices: accept the consequences or try to find a way out of a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his comprehension. When the senior officer stood up and walked toward the door, John knew, whatever happened next, it was going to cost him more than just a little embarrassment. John, still in a state of shock from what had happened, found himself inside a police station, led down long, dimly lit hallways without a word. He couldn't believe that a stupid joke, a failed attempt to kick a guard, had brought him to this. The same thought kept echoing in his head. It couldn't be that serious, could it? But when he was told he was under arrest for public disturbance, he finally understood. This wasn't as simple as he had thought. Hours later, sitting in an interrogation room, John's lawyer finally arrived. He had spoken to him over the phone. Earlier, but now, seeing the man in person, John felt a heavy sense of reality set in. The lawyer was serious, composed, but his expression didn't promise anything good. Without wasting time, he got straight to work, but he didn't hide the fact that the situation was bad. "Do you realize that you broke the law?" the lawyer asked, his tone not accusatory, just matter of fact. John nodded, though in truth, he still struggled to believe he had ended up in this mess. "You disrupted public order, tried to provoke a conflict with security, and now this could end up far more serious than you thought. You're facing a heavy fine and most likely a ban from entering the UK for several years," the lawyer added, flipping through the documents, carefully reviewing the case. John felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. All he had wanted was to explore London, have fun with his friends, and go home with a few funny stories. Instead, his joke, a split-second, impulsive decision, had turned into a nightmare. He was on the verge of losing his chance to ever return to the country, and the prospect of a fine and court hearings made everything worse. The guards he had tried to mess with had shown no outward anger, but their silence and perfect discipline made the situation even more serious. They hadn't protested, hadn't reacted harshly, hadn't even entertained his justifications. Their cold, impassive presence in the police hallway felt like a reminder that every detail had been recorded and would be used against him. Eventually, one of them informed the police that the entire incident had been captured on security cameras, making John's joke official evidence in a criminal case. He struggled to wrap his head around it. All he had wanted was a little fun, but now his actions were part of a legal proceeding. "This isn't over yet, but you need to think very carefully about what's coming next," the lawyer said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You severely underestimated the consequences of what you did." John tried to argue, to defend himself, but every word felt more and more hollow. He realized that his little prank, his willingness to cross a line just for a laugh, had become a lesson he might never have learned otherwise. Strangely enough, it wasn't the threat of punishment that stuck with him the most. It was the silent, unwavering discipline of the guards. Their strict, unyielding presence had set off a chain of events that changed his life. John would never forget how his reckless impulse had led to consequences he never saw coming. When John finally managed to get his punishment reduced, his nervousness didn't disappear right away. His lawyer had negotiated a lower fine, some community service, and a temporary ban from entering the UK. It was a much better outcome than what could have happened, and he knew it. But even with a lighter sentence, the weight of it still hung over him. Instead of enjoying his vacation, John had become a topic of discussion, his actions, which had gone viral. Almost instantly were spreading across social media, the photos of him with the guards, where he once looked like just another tourist, now had a different meaning. He was no longer just a traveler. He was that tourist, the one who tried to kick a guard. News headlines and online comments left no room for humor. People called him the guy who messed with the Queen's Guard. He couldn't escape it. He had become a meme, but not the kind he had hoped for. The following week, as he scrolled through news feeds, he saw his own face in an article about the dumbest tourist incidents in London. Is this what it's come to? The thought flickered in his mind. It was hard to look at his own pictures. The ones that had once captured the joy and excitement of his trip now felt like a mark of shame. His friends started asking questions, some joking, some sarcastic, and he knew his reputation wouldn't be the same again. Looking back on it all, John realized just how quickly impulsive decisions could destroy everything. A few days ago, he had been an ordinary tourist, enjoying his vacation. Now, instead of looking back on his trip with excitement, he was haunted by the consequences of a single careless moment. Over time, John came to understand the weight of his actions. Even the smallest, most seemingly harmless decisions could have unpredictable and devastating consequences. He became more cautious, more thoughtful about his actions. But the lesson was a harsh one, and it left a mark. John would always remember how naive he had been about his joke. He had learned that even the most innocent-seeming acts could carry real consequences, not just for his personal freedom, but for how others perceived him. There was still a long road ahead in his journey of self-awareness, and maybe, just maybe, this was the first serious step in the right direction.